you're seeing population declines in a number of European countries. How does that work out long term?
That's an interesting one. I am not, awfully positive on the economy of China at the moment. We're now at a period where we've almost never seen value underperform as much as it has over the last kind of 15 years or so.
From Nomad Capitalist Live 2023, where we've got every room in the house, we are joined by a very interesting gentleman. He's a quant trader, he's a university professor, he's a YouTuber, Patrick Boyle. Glad to see you here in Kuala Lumpur.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. It's a great city.
It is a great city. We are not so far away from China. You talk a lot about economic issues on your YouTube channel, and you think you break it down better than anybody. What do you make of what's happening in China? Because there are some folks who say this is the last decade of China's ascent. It's going to be all over. Jim Rogers is going to be here. He says, well, I mean, that they have some potential if they open up the currency. What do you make of what's happening in China?
It's fascinating. I'm actually looking forward very much to hearing what Jim has to say, because I recently just was flicking through his book Investment Biker, which I think was written in around 1992 or something like that. And in the book, he called The End of Japan, which was kind of amazing because everyone was very bullish on Japan at that point. And he called The Rise of China. So it'll be really interesting to hear what he has to say. I am not, awfully positive on the economy of China at the moment. And it's just really that there's quite a history of malinvestment in China. We've seen the country do amazing things. There was amazing growth, and how that worked was when, when the economy started opening, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, basically a lot of money came in, and everything that was spent, all of the investment that happened was desperately needed, and so it was spent well. Any project you threw money at, it just bloomed, and so the country saw this amazing growth. But about 15 years ago, the country had sort of reached the end of its need for investment, right? Because there's a variety of things that will cause growth in an economy. But the problem is that if you decide that the only thing that will work is pumping money in, we just have to spend money, the problem with that is you reach a point at which there's enough money, right? At which every project that needs to be built, like, the first hotel you build, it sells out because there's a need for hotels. But if you keep building hotels and hotels and hotels, eventually you've built too many. And so that's really what happened with China. And it kind of happened 10 to 15 years ago. They just were overspending. And the real problem, the essence of the problem is that they target economic growth, they target GDP. And you can always, they basically say, here's the GDP number that needs to be hit, and they instruct the government officials to go out and find ways of hitting that, right? And you can always do that. Like if you pay a guy to dig a hole and another guy to fill it in, that's GDP, right? That's growth, but it's not good. It's malinvestment because, of course, the hole that was dug and filled in has no economic value. It doesn't produce any cash flows. And so throughout China, there's a lot of people in the West, and they look over and they go, look at all these high-speed trains, look at this amazing infrastructure. And it is amazing stuff. Like, I mean, it's, so some of the stuff they built, it looks rather futuristic. But the problem is there's not really a need for that. And so you build all this stuff that there's no need for. Firstly, you've overspend. And secondly, there's kind of upkeep associated with this. And this, by the way, is a thing that's happened throughout history. If you look back at the railway booms that happened in both Europe and the United States around the 1900s. They built railroads everywhere. They built competing railroads, with two lines next to each other. And the assumption was that just everyone would get everywhere on the railroads, and they'd all be hugely profitable. And then not so many people needed to go everywhere on a train. And so, you look at the old maps, if you look at, 100, 150 years ago, the United States had way more rail than it has today. What happened to it? It's like, well, they were bad investments, and eventually they pulled up the tracks. It just didn't make sense anymore. And I think China might be at that point where there's just been too much spending on projects that don't really earn a living, and so the repercussions of that will be interesting.
Here's my concern, because you say Westerners look and say, wow, they have a lot better trains than we do, or they have that. I look at China, and I think a lot of people in the West, and part of what we want to challenge in an event like this, is that people say, well, if China didn't figure out the GDP growth, that all the non-Western countries, it's all just digging a hole and filling it back in. And people say, well, why would I want to go somewhere else? Why would I want to invest somewhere else? Because China did that. I think they kind of extrapolate that to any other emerging economy must be fudging the numbers, must be wasting money. How do you address that?
Well, there's always problems in any, well, frankly, in any economy, and in emerging markets, there's greater risk of corruption, but equally there's sort of a promised higher return, you know? But it's a bit of an interesting thing, because a lot of the time, you know, how do you get a good return out of an investment? You're often putting money in a place where other people aren't, right? Like where you know, you're taking a risk that other people won't take, and basically you get a high return for that. But the last, I don't know, like decade, you look around the world and basically the cost of capital has just come down and down. There's kind of money for everything, you know, like any business you want to start, like, the only businesses you can't raise money for must have the most god-awful business plans ever. You know, over the last decade or so, like, we've got these zero interest rate everything, right? And you see, you know, there's a lot of, you know, I made a video on my channel called, what was it called? Blitzscaling. And it's all about this idea in Silicon Valley where they throw money at, you know, things like WeWork. You know, it's an office building, right? And they claim it's a tech company. Why is it a tech company?
It's a whole new way of humanity.
Yeah. There's a guy who looks like Jesus, and he talks Silicon Valley language, and it was meant to be a tech firm because there's an app and a beer tap, you know, which is different to a normal office building. But the problem that you have with that is you know, you hose money at these businesses, and you get to kind of do that in this zero interest rate environment, because it basically, there's no real cost to that capital other than if the guy utterly wastes it, you know, which he did.
Yeah,
but,
he did.
you know, we've seen this thing where like every business plan gets a go because the cost of capital is so low. Now we're seeing the cost of capital go up, and it's sort of like the tide going out. And, you know, it used to be, we'll say it is zero interest rate environment for businesses. If you give someone $1 and they give you $10 back in 40 years, that's a good return because it's a zero interest rate environment. Well, if the interest rate is higher, if you could make way more money than that with your money in a treasury bond, well, then suddenly those cash flows way out in the future are sort of worth nothing, right? Or they're worth very little. And so we're seeing all of that happen, you know, everywhere in the world. Like, it's, you know, that is, you know, definitely a thing we're seeing in places like Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of people panicking. And, you know, you listen to the kind of VC guys and whatever, and they're like, well, this is madness. When will interest rates go back to their normal level of
zero?
It's like,
normal for when?
You know, it's sort of like the patient has been on a heart machine for the last 5-10 years, and people are like, well, it's quite natural to walk around on a heart machine. You know, it's like, no, that's not a healthy patient.
Do any of those people, though, say, you know what, we're going to put our money in economies where they're building actual stuff, and the cost of capital is like at a certain point, you would think they would say, you know what, Indonesia looks interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, there's even, I have a friend who is an emerging market fund manager out of London, and he invests a lot in Africa, and he's done quite well there because, you know, once again, you've got an actual risk return thing happening there. You know, in fact, actually, one of the funny things that kind of puzzles me a little bit is, I recently made a video talking a bit about sovereign wealth funds, and historically, the way investment has worked is that, like, kind of very developed countries have these sort of big businesses, you know, they've thrown off a lot of cash, and then they spend that, they take that money and they invest it in sort of high growth developing economies. Well, in the last kind of decade, you've got this funny thing where a lot of the sort of developing economies have this huge amount of money because they've all run surpluses, and so they have this huge amount of cash, and they start a sovereign wealth fund and invest it in the West. And it's a rather strange thing, you know, that normally the money would come from like the stable environment to the high growth environment, while instead it appears to be coming from the high growth places and being put in, you know, treasury bonds in the United States.
Let's start a golf tour in the U.S. or whatever.
You know, a Formula One team or an EV startup or something. But yeah,
one of these many things, like someone paid for an NFL American football team $6 billion, wasn't it recently? I mean, those were $10 million or something 40 years ago.
It's crazy. But, you know, if you look at even like the scandal we were talking about earlier, the whole FTX thing, you know, like talk about hosing a guy with money, right? You take a guy who has about 6 months work experience at Jane Street and, you know, quite a look. And you say, well, he must be a genius, look at him. And so you give him a fortune and he squanders it and, you know, spends it on political influence and sponsoring sports teams and, you know, hiring spokespeople. But, you know, once again, you've got a business that there was, you know, a business that historically would never have been funded, where suddenly, you know, zero interest rate environment.
I just see so much less of that around the parts that we're in now. Obviously, you can say there's scripted.
So.
To me, it's like we make rubber stuff. We haul garbage. We do stuff like that, not like we just give some guy with a crazy hairdo who looks kind of weird a bunch of money and he's the messiah.
Yeah.
I don't know that they have that in some of these more functional. I don't think they have the luxury.
Well, it's interesting because you look at, like, in recent years, like, you know, in the very long run, if you want to break sort of the stock market into two easy components, we can talk about growth and value. And the truth is, most of the time, growth does a bit better than value because it's kind of investing in exciting businesses and there's risk there. And so you get rewarded for your risk. But, you know, in the longish run, you often see sort of similar returns from growth and value. One performs well for a period, then the other does. We're now at a period where we've almost never seen value underperform as much as it has over the last kind of 15 years or so. So, you know, it might be reasonable just as an investor to also say, you know, there's sort of times to kind of bet on the exciting things and there's times to bet on the boring things. And so
to that point, I mean, Warren Buffett would say it's all value investing, which I never entirely understood that. Certain things are more speculative. Is that model that he runs, is that a model that you think will become less prevalent? I mean, people have even speculated when Warren Buffett is no longer here, Berkshire Hathaway is going to have to tighten some things up and maybe be a bit more aggressive.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, Warren Buffett, the guy who for decades said that he couldn't stand technology, his biggest investment is Apple.
He says it's not a tech company, though. It's a consumer company.
Well, it's a consumer company that's not priced, you know, it's priced for growth, right?
They're not selling toothpaste.
Yeah. You know, the thing is, you know, you're right, like this idea of what is growth, what is value, like everything kind of is value because you're putting a price on it, right? And so, you know, you can price growth as well. But I guess even if we break it down, another way is just to look at kind of, as you said, like maybe the more staid real economy type companies and the really exciting shoot for the moon companies. And you know, at the moment, you know, if you look at the weighting in the S&P, it's as heavily weighted as it's ever been towards technology, you know. And that the funny thing is, if you look at the tech weighting of the S&P, you know, a lot of things that are priced like technology. For example, Tesla, you know, they view it as a car company because, you know, they build cars, but it's not priced like a car company because it's priced like all of the other car companies combined. You know, so is it tech? Is it value? Well, it's not value.
What do you make? I mean, so the 21st century, Jim Rogers and others would say it's going to belong to Asia. He said, you know, in 2000, if you're smart, you move to Asia. But I think as we get deeper into the 21st century, people say, hey, again, maybe China's played out. Maybe that has an impact around Asia. Does the latter half of the century belong to Africa? And maybe tell me more of what the people that you're talking to are doing and what they're investing in real economies in Africa.
Well, the thing is, you know, I do think there is possibly a very reasonable way to look at the world is that Asia, in particular China, was suppressed for a very long time, like just with terrible government policies and, kind of an economy that boomed hundreds of years ago and then, was suppressed for a very long time. And then once the weight was taken off of it, there was this huge entrepreneurial thing that happened. And actually in Jim's book, Investment Biker, he talks about that. It's the story that he rode his motorcycle around the world, and he first drove through Russia and then he drove through China. And of course, both of them were kind of communist countries at the end of communism. And he just said there was an entrepreneurial spirit in China that there wasn't in Russia. Like the Russians had been too beaten down and they didn't know how to think like business people, while the Chinese were hustling and making smart decisions. And they were kind of being held back by communism, but they were an entrepreneurial people. I think there is an argument just that in the very long run, if people are allowed to work and to thrive, that in a way, the country with the greatest factors of production should probably be the largest economy. And one of the big factors of production is just people. Workers. And, China just has this huge population.
India, Indonesia, Nigeria as well in Africa.
Yeah. I mean, so I think if maybe that's an overly simplistic way of looking at it, but if you wanted to say, like, in 100 years' time, where will stuff be coming from? Where will exciting businesses be happening? Well, the answer probably is where there are people who are doing
They're a lot
stuff,
younger.
So.
I mean, you're seeing population declines.
Yeah.
Certainly not population growth in a number of European countries. How does that work out long term?
That's an interesting one. There's a great book by Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan. I can't think of the name of it, but if you Google their names, you'll find it. And it's a book on demographics. And they have quite an interest. They were actually the only people really predicting the inflation that came in 2019, so pre-COVID and everything else. They argued that inflation was coming, and the reason for this was just the demographic changes. And their argument is that in these economies where you have an aging population, if you think about it, you have people consume, and so small children consume while not producing, hopefully, and the elderly retirees consume but don't produce, And their argument was that if you have these places where there's a small working population and a lot of either small children and retirees, you basically have a small group of people doing all the producing and a large group of people consuming, and there's more consumers than producers equals inflation, just prices go up. And that was kind of their argument. And I think that's an interesting way to look at the demographics in terms of, how it's likely to affect economies. Now, there's all these, the thing that affects everything is just the growth of productivity that comes through technology. And so, we are likely to see, just greater use of robots and things like that, Well, I mean, ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen that greater mechanization equals greater productivity per person. And so we're likely to see more investment in that as we see populations age.
So where you're from, where in the UK?
London.
In London, has had stubbornly high inflation compared to some of the other Western countries. What does that do? Well, one of the things I think we're talking about here is you're going to have more people getting frustrated with the government and probably drive out more of the productive class as you see more restrictive policies on business to make people feel better that they're being priced out. But what do you see?
Well, it's a very interesting thing because you could talk about the recent inflation in the UK and say, well, that doesn't look great. But actually, if we go back to, I believe at the end of the Second World War, the exchange rate was $10 to a pound, and it's just slowly declined ever since then. When I first moved to London, it was 2 to 1. Now it's about 1 to 1. It's getting close to 1 to 1.
Yeah.
And so basically what you see with high inflation is that you just see the decline of the value of the currency. And so that has happened in Britain over time, and it appears to be continuing. So
Nigel Farage was here last year, obviously spearheaded Brexit. What are your thoughts on what people in the UK think about that? Are people blaming Brexit for their woes on these issues?
It's hard to say because, I have to admit that I live in a bit of a bubble. Like I live in central London, and most of my friends are kind of professionals who are often not native Brits who make their money reaching out into the world, And so, most of the people I know would have been against Brexit and are unhappy with Brexit. Other people in the UK, maybe not as much, and there's kind of, it's very easy. I don't think it was a great solution. And in fact, I would argue that it was only put forth, David Cameron basically said, we'll have a vote on this. It's my belief that it came just after the vote for Scottish independence, and the Scottish turned that down. Like, they made a big noise. They negotiated a better deal with the UK, and then they rejected the Scottish exit from Britain. And so I think that David Cameron thought that Britain could do the same thing within Europe, make a big noise, say we'll do this thing, you put it to the vote.
Appear magnanimous in a sense.
Yeah, and you kind of negotiate a better deal. And the people voted for it. I think to many people's surprise, and there are pros and cons to it. For me and for the people I know, I think maybe more cons than pros. I think it is hard on the economy, but in truth, the British economy is not doing a whole lot worse than other parts of the world right now. There is higher inflation. Some of the real problems in the UK are just that people's mortgages are generally tied to a floating rate. Like, that's the way you borrow in the UK. You can lock in for 2 or 5 years.
You've talked about that. It's not this for people who are from the United States, for example, here. Yeah. The 30-year fixed mortgage, you're locked. That doesn't exist in the UK.
It's not an option. And so, when people in the UK say they've got a fixed mortgage, they mean for 2 or 5 years. And then
that seems dangerous.
It does. It's an interesting thing because in the very long run, being exposed to the floating rate tends to be a bit cheaper than being exposed to the fixed rate, except when mortgage rates are at historic lows.
What's happened for the last 15 years? Yeah.
Yeah, when you can borrow at 2-3%, it's like, you really think it's going lower? Maybe it's time to lock, but
Give the use case for people who are here, who are saying, hey, I'm from the US, I'm from the UK, I'm from Australia. It's overpriced. They've taken away our freedoms. We don't see the future. What's the use case for the people that you're talking to and you're friends with in London for why they are in London when they're doing so much else in the world, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because London is by far, I think, the most international city that I've ever been to. There's sort of statistics of how many languages are spoken within the city, and it's I think, amongst the highest in the world. And so, I'm originally from Ireland, and many of my friends, they're all like Italian, Greek, Spanish, Indian, Russian, whatever they might be. And they all came to London, and they like it in London because there's a very good lifestyle, at least if you're kind of well-to-do within London. And, many of them have bought homes, they're raising children, and, sort of the economic tide goes out. And I think there are many who are kind of, holding out to see if things will come back. Equally, they're very mobile people, like you kind of, in fact, when I go back and look at during the credit crunch, there was a huge loss of jobs within the city of London, there were no jobs for bankers for a while. Many of my friends, they were from all over the world, and when the credit crunch kicked in, they lose a job, they hunt around a bit for another job, and then they just look globally, because if you're from Germany and you're living in London and you get offered a job in Dubai or Singapore or wherever, I mean, why not?
Go where you're treated best.
Yeah, and really, I think within the financial industry, to a certain extent, the people are kind of mercenaries. Like they turn up to work to make money, and if you take the money away, they go to where it's gone.
Isn't that natural for anybody? I mean, if you take anybody's money away, they're gonna go somewhere else. Don't you think?
Say that, but actually, I was a little bit surprised. I once again, researching a video, I learned that the average American, and you would think of Americans as reasonably mobile, at least within the country. Sure. The average American lives 18 minutes. Yeah, I forget what it was, miles or minutes, but considering you can drive 60 miles per hour, let's say it's the same. The average American lives either 18 miles or minutes from their mother's home, So you think that people can and do move all over, but they don't really move as much as might economically make sense for them. And, Americans are actually more mobile than people in other parts of the world. So while it's easy to say, I think you and I can take a world view, where you kind of go, well, gosh, I can, the kind of work I do and the way I live and where my friends are, I can kind of just look around and live wherever I want to. The majority of people really don't think that way. They live kind of where...
Well, we're working on it.
Where they landed.
And I'll tell you, listen, my father's here, and I mean, the idea that he would have gone to Mexico 10 years ago, he wouldn't have even considered it. Now he spends half his year, he bought a property, and he's almost like, if the Kings keep going the way they're going, I'm moving there full time.
Yeah.
I think things
now, did you give him the push?
I think that us doing it is probably an inspiration. I mean, when people see you, it's one thing to talk about it, it's one thing to watch the videos, but I think when people see you take an action, I think that's probably the best way to do it.
If you've never moved anywhere, it seems like shocking and wild,
right.
But once you've moved a few times, I don't know, eventually you call a mover, they load your stuff up, and off you go.
And I really think everyone, people moving to Miami. If you're moving, you might as well just move. You have, I think, the best situation, being an Irish citizen, so you can just go and live in London without having to have the UK passport, which perhaps geopolitically could be at some point a little dicey. I mean, Irish, everyone loves the Irish. You can go the EU direction. You can also, the only passport besides the UK that can live in the UK.
Well, it's an interesting thing because when I grew up, it was a terrible path. I have 3 passports, but I have a US and Irish passport when I was growing up, and the good one was the American passport. You could go anywhere in the world with that. And the Irish one, there was lots of stamping of the passport and standing in lines and explaining that you're really just on holiday and not moving there.
Because in the late 70s and 80s, it was much worse than it is today.
Oh, for like 800 years, people left Ireland, right? But
people who are 50 today are like, oh, it was tough back then.
Well, it's funny. I left Ireland in 1997, and for very logical reasons. I felt it rained too much, and so I moved in '97, and up until that point,
to London?
No, to the United States.
Okay.
And yeah, there's 2 really. In Ireland, there were kind of 2 things you could watch on TV back then. There was Dallas and EastEnders, so it's a rather depressing idea to move to London rather than the United States when you're Irish. It's like sun, convertibles, cowboy hats, So yeah, Baywatch, where are you going? It's not London. And so, I moved out of Ireland in '97, and that was almost the turning point at which Ireland became a country that people moved out of to it becoming a country that people moved to. And I go home now and I almost don't recognize, I find it very funny, like you'll meet people from all over the world and they'll walk up to you and speak with a strong Dublin accent, and you're like, that never happened years ago,
Oh, it's becoming more like London, it seems now, in a mini scale, much more international and developing very, I think by some metrics, the most expensive place to live and the highest incomes in the world by some metrics.
Yeah.
Remarkable turnaround. Talk about what you think with BRICS and what's going on. New countries are joining, others want to join. My concern is some folks say, who cares about these little countries? I think it becomes something over time. What do you think?
You see, my problem with BRICS is that it's sort of a made-up construct to start with. Like the term BRICS just came from a guy at Goldman Sachs who kind of lumped together a few.
And then they just kind of adopted it.
Yeah, and then they suddenly decided we are a thing like the EU or something. But it's like but they have no like cultural connection. Many of them, the biggest two countries in there, China and India, can't stand each other and have daily border disputes, And there's all these other countries who sort of say they want to join, and of course Putin is kind of pounding the table that this is the future, but it's because it's the only people who'll trade with him at the moment, right? But the problem with BRICS as an economic construct is that China is so much bigger than everything else in there, that basically if you were to team, it's sort of, like Argentina teaming up with China. It's like you're just a subsidiary of China at that point. None of these countries want to be that, right? Like there's no way.
Isn't it good to have an option, though? I mean, I know here in Malaysia, there's prime ministers who talked about, we were always with the U.S., and we still share some values with the U.S., but they take us for granted. They don't do much. Like, why are we just a rubber stamp for them?
You don't have to lock yourself into like an economic group either. Like, and actually, in the real world, like people want to talk about BRICS, but if you look at what India is a great example. India will trade with China, they'll trade with the Russians, they definitely will trade with the United States, and they're being smart and sitting on the fence, right? Like they kind of say, they sort of do their best to kind of go, you guys have your fights, we won't get involved, we'll buy and sell stuff from you guys. And we'll try not to get anyone too upset with us. And I think that's really, all of these countries want to do that. Like they'll talk a big game about, this new order that's likely to come about. But if you think about, like, we'll say if you're a small country and you're going to like really tie your boat to a bigger country, which you don't have to do, but we'll say if you decided to, and your options are China or the United States, who's going to stomp down on you more is kind of the question. And I would argue that maybe China will stomp down on their own citizens. How are they going to treat, the sort of people of a small country who's decided that they're now buddies with China? It's equally, I'm not so sure that the United States would be that generous to a
I'm not convinced that they are.
No, like just to be clear, because often whenever I speak about something and I kind of say, well, something about China, people kind of go, well, you didn't bring up the United States. It's like, no, because I wasn't talking about that.
Yeah, the what about it is good. I thought one of the best lines from the Trump presidency was he did that interview and he's like, what do you think our people are so innocent? We're so innocent. I thought it was high time someone said that. I mean, look at. Let me just take a look at Cuba, and look at how they're complaining that Cuba's now teaming up with China. They tried to bring Cuba more into the fold, and then they undid it. And it's like, well, what are you supposed to do? I kind of, for that reason, I say, I'm glad for optionality.
Yeah. Well, I think in the real world, all of these countries are and will pursue that optionality, where they'll tell everyone that they want to be friends with them and we'll join this group and we'll join that group. But when push comes to shove, they'll look after themselves, which is the only sensible thing to do. And so I think any like really big arguments about these countries clubbing up together and sort of a new order generated from that.
So you think India is a success story, perhaps, but the BRICS thing you think is overblown?
Yeah, I just don't think that these countries have any real. I think that they're slightly joined together by nervousness about the behavior of the United States from time to time, or nervousness about being a small country in the world. And so you kind of think, well, gosh, if we could team up and sort of be part of an equal partnership, but the problem is that there's very few really equal partnerships you can join up to, so.
Do you think the same thing applies to the EU? I kind of think, what does Ireland and Bulgaria have in common?
It's an interesting thing because there are, we've seen like, back, what was it, in around 2011 or so when there was the whole European crisis, there can be cracks there as well. Like whenever the economies start to diverge from each other, Greece and Germany sure weren't looking too friendly at each other back then. The EU seems to work reasonably well, but there's no great guarantee that that's a unit that will stick around in, 100 years' time, for example. But for the moment, it appears to be moving forward.
You're gonna think for an English speaker, having an Irish passport or a UK passport, be able to go back and forth between those maybe offers personal optionality. Do you think the EU expands in the meantime? Do you think Ukraine gets into the EU?
Gosh, that's an interesting one. I don't think the EU would naturally expand. Like, you know, there might be political reasons they decide to bring Ukraine in. I think it would be very difficult.
A big country compared
it's a
to
big country
Moldova
that will be that is devastated, and by the time it came time to bring it in, you know, would be a very large country in very bad economic shape. And then also, I do feel that they're probably, you know, everyone talks a good game, but they're probably, if things come to a settlement between Russia and Ukraine, people will walk softly around it, you know, in order to let, it's a bit like the situation in the north of Ireland. When things calm down in the north of Ireland, people, you know, there's certain buttons you don't push, and then everything can move forward, and eventually a greater peace can be found. So the Ukraine one, who knows, but I wouldn't really bet on it. And then I think that the EU still has a lot of internal settling that needs to happen before they start bringing in more countries.
Is it easier to bring in Montenegro, where some of our guests are from, or you don't think that happens either?
Well, you know, it's sort of easier to bring in smaller countries just because there's an interesting thing where actually Ireland is the funny example within the EU, because people saw Ireland come into the EU and absolutely boom. And it was viewed that if a country joins the EU, that everything takes off. But, you know, you look, Portugal came into the EU roughly around the same time. I think it may have come in a few years earlier. But the economy in Portugal has stagnated over the same period. So it's not really just EU. You know, the sort of silver bullet that EU membership looks like.
People think it's a silver bullet.
Yeah.
Maybe it was people in Ireland, the same way in business, right? Oh, they didn't get lucky. Maybe there was something they did.
Well, I think there were a lot of things that lined up to work for Ireland around that time. I think also even just having a rather favourable tax policies, I think an educated workforce that spoke English, you know, there's many things that happen.
Nice to deal with.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you know, there's even just good tourism. You know, it's a beautiful country to visit.
Feels familiar for Americans.
And actually, even like because so many Irish people have moved abroad, there's a big group of people who kind of can view it as going home to a certain extent. But yeah, I don't know. Like I think there's often many things that come together that make something work. And it doesn't mean that if you do the same thing again, that it will definitely work again the next time.
Quite frankly, and I put my money where my mouth is, if I have to choose between Serbia and Bulgaria, I'd rather have the one without the EU. For me, the optionality there is better.
Well, even countries like Switzerland or whatever, they kind of, you know, in many ways, there's lots of European countries that are not part of the EU that have decent trade agreements and kind of get to have many of the benefits. In fact, that's almost one of the things that possibly led to Brexit, was that the problem was that Britain had such a good deal, you know, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, that they
currency, Schengen.
Yeah, like and even like they had an awful lot of say, and you know, and they probably could have just negotiated better within the EU and had the security of having their own currency. But, you know, there's many countries around Europe that are outside of the EU that still get many of the benefits of being part of a big bloc that trades.
I think Serbia takes in a very small way that India approach you mentioned. Lastly, I'll ask you though, FTX has been a very interesting saga to watch for about a year now. You've talked a lot about this. What are your insights on FTX and what's going to happen and what's going to happen to this guy?
Well, I think Sam is going to go to jail, right? Like
Forever?
I mean, he's Bernie Madoff. Like there's no way around it. You know, you kind of set up this business, you take all the money, you spend it on I don't know what, buy a big house for your parents, pay some politicians, name a stadium. It's all fun and games, but eventually you stole $8 billion. You know, it's hard to avoid jail time with that. There's not really he's been explaining himself for about a year, and I think he hasn't come up with a good enough explanation for people to kind of go, oh, okay, it's a simple mistake, you know.
Well, they were using QuickBooks to keep track of the money.
Yeah, I mean, it's the wildest story. Actually, I mentioned to you earlier, there's a very good book that I just read by Zeke Foe. I think it's called Line Goes Up or Number Goes Up. I forget what it's called. I read a pre-release copy. It comes out in a few days. But he was looking into Tether, which is another cryptocurrency. And amusingly, he was kind of searching for all the red flags with Tether, expecting that to fall apart. And then FTX blew up right next to him, and he was kind of like, oh, how did that happen? You know, he was sort of so focused on because there's so many things in the world of cryptocurrency that look off, that in a funny way, you know, Sam Bankman-Fried almost looked like the cleanest of the group, but turned out not to be.
That's always struck me. What do they call they've called the U.S. among the West, what, the cleanest shirt in a dirty laundry basket? Is that supposed to be such a good designation?
It's sort of, you know, you win a beauty contest, but at the Burns ward of the hospital. There's, you know, it's good and bad, you know, like it's good to be the best looking, but.
Yeah. I had a dog when I was 13 years old. I taught him to race, and he came in third place, which everyone thought was pretty good, but there were only 3 dogs, it turns out. So with that, Patrick Boyle of YouTube, thanks for being with us in KL.